I'm putting my Chaucer cameo right at the beginning. As you'll recall in Chaucer's House of Fame, shortly after the dreamer falls asleep, I'll try this thing again, and finds himself in a temple of glass, he describes the following scene. But as he roamed up and down, he found that on a wall there was thus written on a table of brass. He will now singing if he can, the armies, and also the man that first came through his destiny, fugitive of Troy country, in Untitled, with full much pain, when told the strongest of the vein. 2 notes on this passage. First of all, the reference to a table of brass. Let's see if this one works. No, I'll use the arrow. Or at least a table bearing text of some kind reflects a very familiar textual form in Chaucer's England. And second, these tables frequently did contain the kind of information that Chaucer records here. Foundation legends and histories, in this case from Virgil, but elsewhere in known examples, information about Joseph of Arimathea, the Trojan Brutus, and King Arthur. It was common, in other words, to find, if not the matter of Rome, then certainly the matter of Britain on medieval English tables. And as I'll show in greater detail in a moment, even very lengthy texts, I mean not quite as long as the Aeneid, could be found on tabulae, or tables, tablets, as they're alternatively called. But if we turn more specifically to the 2 lines preceding the reference to a table of brass, we find something much less common in records of tabulae. The circumstances of their production, their presentation and their reception, and a straightforward indication that the information recorded originated with a tabula in the first place. But as he roamed up and down, he found that on a wall there was. What Chaucer gives us, in some way, is a subtle but fascinating literary depiction of the relationship between written record and lived experience at the end of the 14th century. The circumstances of encountering the text in the House of Fame are very easy to pass by, and indeed, without this kind of explicit contextual information, we may not always be able to recover if a particular textual reference originally came from a tabula, because most tables, far from having been engraved in brass or some sort of alloy of that sort, but typically instead inscribed on parchment that was pasted onto wooden boards, these have either decayed, gone missing, or been destroyed when many conflicts ensued. Sometimes the only way we can learn that they existed at all is through epitomes, rather than full transcripts of their contents, or itemized catalogs of antiquities that inventory them alongside other objects of note in a particular church. And they usually do seem to have come from churches for the most part, although I don't want to rule out other locations. And while at least one of these tabulae, indeed one of only 3 from England to survive, has been characterized as, quote, a permanent reference collection to be consulted on-site only, end of quote, on-site only because it's so huge that it'd be really conspicuous if you were taking it out. The fact remains that the tabular medium itself was seldom noted explicitly in subsequent narratives that seem to derive from them, or could be argued to have derived from them. Occasionally, though, it is possible to tell that what appears to be a first-hand account has in fact been transcribed from a tabula. And I suspect that a great many more details than we realize in travel writings and chronicles are received narratives of a kind that were copied from ephemeral textual forms that no longer survive. My talk today will present some of my many reasons for believing this. Not many reasons, but a few reasons. Hoping to give many more reasons. But I should also note in passing that other evidence that medieval experiences of structures and cities could be highly mediated and then stereotyped. And these are very familiar situations. And that medieval accounts of such interactions represent a middle ground between direct and derived experience. We're very familiar with Margery Kempe in traveling to the Holy Land. She casts her pilgrimage as a supremely personal encounter with the sites in the Holy Land. And I don't want to rule out the possibility that personalized experience can coexist with guided tours. I'm not suggesting that, although I prefer not to go on guided tours. But what we may not realize is that Margery's account follows almost precisely the sequence prescribed in the Franciscan Guides to the Holy Land. And these are itineraries that the Franciscans themselves on site would facilitate in guiding tourists around. And some of the most, and this is a different type of example, some of the most interesting recent scholarship, and not that recent scholarship as well, on the Book of John Mandeville, has centered on its author's heavy and nearly exclusive, as some would argue, reliance on a well-stocked library. armchair tourism is cast as the fruit of personal experience of the world's wonders. Similarly, Petrarch is thought to have once said, well, I'm not going to go to Jerusalem because I can read about it just fine in this itinerary I've got. So textual authority and lived experience, as the wife of Beth will tell you, make very strange but surprisingly harmonious bedfellows. What is of significant interest in coming to a fuller understanding of the use and prevalence of tabulae is the degree to which various locations in England and on the continent, this is not just an English phenomenon by any means, were legible. The way in which they spoke for themselves, as it were, mediating lived experience through documentary prompting and display. And as the picture of this relatively unstudied textual form takes on greater definition, the architectural landscape of medieval England becomes increasingly interactive. Indeed, it gives rise to a narrative topography that forms an integral part of what has become a relatively recent fascination with local histories and the historiography of place. Yet this is a topography that must be negotiated for its competing claims on the legendary histories that are said to infuse local sites and shrines, a negotiation that unfolds through human interaction with words written on parchment, glued onto wooden panels, and hung on pillars and walls. But to return to Chaucer's reference by way of providing some additional background. Not only was the tabula a familiar textual form in Chaucer's England, it was in Chaucer's time, and continuing into the following century from what I'm able to tell, that the tabula first became a widespread textual form. And as I've said, we know of only 3 English tabulae to survive today. 2 of them are in York Minster. One of them is from Glastonbury Abbey, and it's now in the Bodley. All 3 were produced in the last 2 decades of the 14th century or the early years of the 15th. Other examples are recorded of tabulae that no longer survive. Once displayed, for example, in the cathedrals of Durham, Lichfield, Lincoln, Ripon, and Winchester, some of them still on site in the 17th century when James Ussher described them, 1687. Other examples could once be found in the Church of St. Peter upon Cornhill, and a site that I'll return to in a moment, St. Paul's in London. Their dates, from what can be discerned, span the late 14th to the 16th century. Tables could serve many descriptive or directive purposes. The extant examples from York and Glastonbury provide universal and institutional histories. Details about miracles associated with the site, saints, privileges, foundations. The most famous example, I'll show the image of here, the Magna Tabula Glatoniensis, exploits the attractive legends of King Arthur, drawing primarily from Chronicles of William of Malmesbury and John of Glastonbury. We're briefly told in this table of the coming of Joseph of Arimathea to Britain, of the deeds of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and of a number of saints, Patrick, Bridget, David, who all bear witness to Glastonbury's activity, its sanctity over other places, and its privileges. In other words, these tablets could serve as concise chronicles, distillations, as it were, of more expansive legendary histories. They could be politically motivated, and they often were, as in this case. And they could also advertise the fame and the virtues of a pilgrimage shrine. You can see, just to describe this a little bit, if you're not already familiar with this one, a very large wooden frame. It's 48 inches by 21 inches when the box is closed. It's got 6 writing surfaces altogether, these internal leaves, and they are called folia in most of the accounts. They've got text on both sides. They can be turned like a book. And can be fixed to the wall. I've got a color image up close so you can see the script. It's very fine, very fine. All sorts of finding aids. It's very user-friendly, as it were. Other known tabulae provided information about monuments within a church itself, including images and tombs. One especially interesting example of this from the priory at Worksop Abbey is recorded in Dugdale's Monasticon Anglicanum, which is one of our primary sources about these kinds of textual displays. And this one, surprisingly, was written in 29 Middle English rhyme royal stanzas. It encourages readers to confirm its descriptions by checking them against the monuments in the church that it describes. I won't read this, but I'll give an example of one of the stanzas. I'm going to talk about the precious stones. If you want to see if this precious stone is where I say it is, go check it out. The tomb's over there, okay, in rhyme royal. And finally, one of the most common types of tabula contained indulgences, or lists of indulgences that were associated with a specific shrine. This is true of back to the Glastonbury tabula on the very last leaf. A massive list, 80 indulgences in total, that were granted to the local bishops of Bath and Wells from all over Europe. There were more modest tabulae as well, and they present the terms of a specific indulgence itself or other lists of indulgences as their sole content. I found one of these last year in Prague. This is from the Rosenberg family collection. You can see there's two writing surfaces. It can be closed. It's got little hinges there. And its exclusive content is a list of indulgences. I'm not actually sure what site it went with because it wasn't in that site, its original location. So far I've discussed the forms and contents of known tabulae, but I'm really interested in how people may have interacted with these things. And there's very little to go on when we're trying to answer questions of that sort. The few studies of tabulae that there are almost uniformly note that these tables were likely set up for the benefit of visitors. I really don't have any reason to challenge that assumption. Jean Crocalis, for example, writes of the Glastonbury tabula, and I quote, "The 15th century pilgrim who could read Latin by the candlelight available in the abbey would be thoroughly informed about what Glastonbury considered its authentic story and the spiritual benefits he or she could gain from being there." End of quote. Yet no one, to my knowledge, seems to have found much evidence of visitors benefiting from tabulae, whether those at Glastonbury or anywhere else. Chaucer's comments, of course, don't satisfactorily provide that kind of evidence, but they do at least intimate what a visitor might do with a table, how one might orient oneself in an architectural setting by means of textual displays, presumably set up for the purpose. There is, however, more to the story. Recently, I found in Prague an itinerary of a Bohemian traveler who recorded details of his travels from Prague to London and then further west in England. I've written about aspects of this itinerary somewhere else, mostly in connection with the eulogies of Anne of Bohemia that he found situated around her tomb at Westminster Abbey. But there are some other fascinating details that the itinerary reveals that I'd like to discuss here today. On the surface, in fact, the itinerary looks remarkably boring. It mostly consists of dry factual descriptions, distances between cities, measurements of structures, brief lists of relics kept in particular shrines, without much embellishment. His most inventive, or his favorite adjective is just beautiful. That's all he can really say. And only occasional hints at local lore. Here's one example. This one comes from the bit from the itinerary that talks about Westminster Hall. He writes, bear with me, it's boring, okay? There is also a palace that is 66 swords in length and 18 swords in breadth, and the preparation of the palace is from beams, the beauty of which has never been seen. How beautiful? Could you tell us more? No. He goes on to another structure. So length, breadth, materials used. These are characteristic of the account all the way through. And they remind one of the often detached and accumulative material descriptions that proliferate in the Book of John Mandeville. There's a sense, in my view, that the traveler's collecting structures by means of, what he claims to, it seems, by means of measuring them, okay, and then listing their features in the kind of uniform cadence of a cataloger. Here's another example, this time from the traveler's description of St. Paul's in London. Just before. The church of St. Paul contains within its limits 3 acres and a half of land, 1 rood and a half, and 6 covered perches. The length of this same church is 690 feet, and the breadth is 130 feet. Height, okay, you get it. Okay. Now, it's of course, these are interesting descriptions in part because they provide information about structures that no longer survive. Sometimes the details that are provided challenge what John Stowe writes in the 16th century in his survey of London. He offered competing narratives and descriptions of structures in London. Now, of course, Westminster Hall does survive to this day, but St. Paul's Cathedral, as the traveler would have seen it, was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666. But what really interests me about the traveler's description of St. Paul's is that an almost identical description is found in M.S. Harley 565. And the relevant section reads as follows. I'll just read the first part of the English. The Church of St. Paul, London, contains within its limits 3 acres and a half of land, 1 rood and a half, and 6 covered perches. It's identical. You can see. In fact, I'll show you how identical it is All the red part is basically exactly the same, almost to the word. Okay, so something interesting is going on. And the description continues for some time. The one in the Harleian manuscript is much longer than the one in the Bohemian Traveller's itinerary. And of still further interest to me is the heading that's given to this description in the Harleian manuscript. A copy of a table hanging on a column next to the tomb of the Duke of Lancaster, who's John of Gaunt, you figure out the name, in the Church of St. Paul in London. Okay. And sure enough, in the Bohemian Traveller's account, the description of the Duke of Lancaster's tomb immediately follows these general facts about the dimensions of the church. I can't tell, from what I have available to me yet, whether the Bohemian Traveller also transcribed his information about the Duke of Lancaster's tomb directly from another tabula, but there is evidence to suggest that in St. Paul's, as elsewhere, visitors could be guided by a number of tabulae on display. The transcription of the table recording the dimensions of St. Paul's in the Harleian manuscript is accompanied, for example, by 2 other transcriptions of tabulae, all of them once hanging on pillars that surrounded the choir of the church. They're all said, you can figure this out, they're all said to have hung near tombs that are known. Here I am getting my information from Stowe in the 16th century. They're known to, these tombs were situated around the choir in St. Paul's. One of them hung between the tomb of the Duke of Lancaster and the tomb of Roger, the Bishop of London, who died in 1241. They're sort of interspersed between the tombs around the choir, it seems. And another one also hung by Roger's tomb, presumably set up on another pillar. The first of these records events of significance to St. Paul's up to the time of Richard II. Now, of course, anyone who reads medieval chronicles is familiar with the fact that these chronicles record natural disasters and things like this, phenomena, alongside political and other events. But this chronicle in tabular form takes special delight in nature behaving badly. It's almost to the exclusion of everything else. This is about what its content is. And it makes me wonder, why didn't the Bohemian Traveller copy this one? I mean, maybe it wasn't there when he came, but maybe he was only interested in measurements and things like that. We get fires, plagues, we get violent winds, we get birds flying through the air with lighted coals in their beaks, dropping them and setting fire to houses, spirits fluttering around in the tempest. I mean, it's really great. This is sensational historiography. This is not designed to make St. Paul's look like a dull destination. Now, the other table, the third of the 3 that I'm talking about, that seem to have been located in St. Paul's, it's called a magna tabula, and it really must have been large to have held all of the text that it was recorded in the Harleian manuscript. It lists the major kings of England from the foundation of England to Henry VI, devoting special attention to the role of Brutus, and it even includes a first dialogue kind of between Brutus and Diana. This one is derived from Geoffrey of Monmouth. I think it's pretty clear. As well as a poetic address to visitors that introduces that dialogue. Okay? Nor were tabulae always designed to be solitary textual units. They could also direct visitors to other monuments, as I've said, or to other sections of a building. There's also evidence that some of them cross-referenced each other, which is kind of interesting. Creating a kind of integrated experience, a closed loop, if you will, of interaction with an architectural space. Records of 3 tabulae that were once situated around the choir, here's the choir again, at the Church of Stone Priory in Staffordshire were cross-referenced. The one situated on the left, or the epistle side of the choir, referred to names written in a table on the Rechtsee the choir. Okay? And notably, too, these tables were written in Middle English exclusively, and were for the most part written in verse. Now, returning to the Bohemian Traveller's account of his English itinerary, and bearing in mind what I've just outlined regarding the contents of certain tabulae, I suspect that a number of his references, and not just the one from St. Paul's that I've been able to confirm, originated with tabular inscriptions. For one thing, his accounts of other structures emphasize the same kinds of detail, using similar modes of description. But it's interesting because they don't always use the same units of measurement. So he's not being consistent with his units of measurement and this kind of thing. So I suspect that he's actually just getting these units of measurement and the measurements themselves from these displays. We also know that this traveler copied other openly available texts on his trip in England, the 3 verse eulogies of his countrywoman, Anne of Bohemia. The possibility that he copied still others is still more fascinating when we find that later in his description, the traveler goes to Windsor Castle and reports on events from Arthurian legend that were said to have been associated with that site. This is what he writes. This is probably the most sort of exuberant he gets. The castle of Windsor stands 5 miles apart from London, which is odd. I don't know where he gets that. In which reside 24 from the fraternity of St. George, and in any given year they solemnly perform a mass in the other offices, and it is said that in that place was King Arthur, as well as the others, namely Percival. There's supposed to be a semicolon after Percival. And the others from the Round Table were also there when, at the first opportunity upon attaining the knightly status, Percival came with from his mother and killed there the Red Knight. This is being associated with Windsor Castle, with St. George. It's very interesting. In his spelling of Arthur, Artusz, the 2 S's in modern Czech, it would be S with the hook, Hacek, suggests to me at least his familiarity with the very recently translated Czech romances. They were translated from the German. Tandariasha Floribela was translated in 1380. I situate the itinerary around the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries. And Tristram Isolde was translated around 1400. I've already said that information about Arthur is known to have been included on the Glastonbury table. But it's very possible, I think, that a number of sites in England similarly saw the benefit of proclaiming their associations with Arthur in tabular form as well. Not least St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the home of the relatively recently formed chivalric Order of the Garter, modeled after the Round Table. And although we know of no surviving tabulae associated with Windsor Castle or St. George's Chapel, Dugdale suggests in the Monasticon that several were once located in the chapel. One of them was situated above a small altar on the north side of the church, opposite the high altar, and it contained the Passion of St. George. Now, these descriptions are very vague. It's not clear if this is a textual description, if this is pictorial. It's really not. I can't tell from Dugdale. Another clearly did contain images. This was, in this case, Mary and John at the crucifixion. It's called a tabula in Dugdale's account. It may have been something along the lines of what we would call a diptych or some sort of altarpiece or something like this. A third, and this one on the high altar, is also called a tabula, but contains images and words at the same time. Make of it what you will, but I think it's safe to say that in George's Chapel, there were tabulae of some sort, Dugdale leaves the distinction between tables and other kinds of display pretty open, I think. He's very inclusive in his descriptions. He calls the leaves folia, he calls all of these things by the same name. And I don't want to expand my topic very much further to discuss other kinds of related textual or display, not textual necessarily in detail, but I will at least note the hangings like the so-called Arma Christi rolls, these large parchment rolls that contain verses on the Passion together with very graphic depictions of Christ's suffering. These were sometimes available in churches to facilitate lay devotion. And of course, the Mappa Mundi. These were wall hangings, of course, you all know, like the Hereford map. They were also available for public perusal and constructed for display, using the same kinds of materials that the tabulae I've been describing used. So I guess what I'm suggesting here is to limit interactive and publicly available displays to those with linguistic narratives is to create a kind of false dichotomy. There are any number of things facilitating interactions with these spaces. But my main concern here is to understand how narrative tabulae mediated lived experience, and specifically how subsequent narratives transformed or masked their documentary sources. And here it's instructive, once again, to return to Chaucer's House of Faith. Immediately following the passage I cited at the beginning, the dreamer continues, as you all know, I'm sure, to epitomize the Aeneid. But the epic's mode of presentation in the Temple of Glass constantly shifts until it's unclear how the dreamer's account, which mingles with his own experiences in the temple, is derived from any representational or at least textual form on the walls. Jill Mann describes the transformation in a way that I think ties nicely with my discussion so far. The description of the table rase, with the translation of the first lines of the Aeneid into Middle English, Mann writes, and I quote, is duly followed by a lengthy resume on the rest of the poem, which Chaucer claims he saw on the wall. In what form, it is not entirely clear, since with dream-like vagueness, the words give way to pictures, the story is at one moment engraved, at another painted on the wall, and shortly afterwards, grave again. Already, that is, the second-hand summary is assuming independent life. The words refashion themselves into mental pictures on which attention may linger or focus in greater detail. End of quote. The dreamlike vagueness of Chaucer's poem is subtly employed to elide the distinction between reportage and new poetic emphases as a received poem is recast to become something else. In the case of the Bohemian Traveler, we might substitute disregard for narrative context for dreamlike vagueness, or perhaps experience and written record blend to become the same thing for him, and presumably for others like him. But the result is essentially the same. Tabulae are recast to become a less mediated kind of reported experience. And as narrative is transferred, the mediating form is elided, erased, something in the process. The Bohemian visitor's itinerary gives the impression that he has taken his own measurements, or that he received certain legendary information from some other source than a tablet. The source is obscure. The location becomes not replete with texts and legibility in the traditional sense, but through what is cast as a first-hand account capable of conveying information and meaning on its own. The stories are the structures, and the structures tell stories. What kind of text, then, does a tabula offer? A tabula invites communal interaction with and dissemination of its narratives. A tabula invites one to receive its narrative as fact, but perhaps through its situation within an architectural setting, fact that is separable from its originary material form, capable of being passed on as first-hand observation and reportage. I suggest, in fact, that when it comes to medieval travelers' itineraries and descriptions of monuments, tabulae may very well be a largely unacknowledged missing link between human experience and its reporting. And of course, the possibility of yet another level of mediation, oral mediation, someone actually reading it to a group or to a person or translating it, especially the Latin ones, this is also something to be very intriguing. I found no evidence of this, unfortunately. I would love to find some. This is another layer. Yet at the same time, knowledge that an account derived from a tabula should not be taken as proof that medieval travelers place little value in first-hand experience. They may very well have regarded interaction with a tabula as direct experience in the first place of a kind. A tabula is perhaps most appropriately regarded as a narrative cue, not expected to be replicated precisely, not entirely acknowledged, and gradually, as in Chaucer's departure from the table of grace, the second-hand narrative draws away from its tabular source, taking on a form that was never there in the original in quite the same way at all. Thank you.